Chains clattered in the night, flames flickered against the cane fields. At dawn on Easter morning, 1760, Jamaica trembled. Machetes, once tools of labor, became weapons of vengeance. In a single sweep, white masters and overseers were cut down like cane stalks. Blood drenched the soil where slaves had wept for centuries. Behind this storm of fury stood one man, a former African chief turned slave. His name was Tacky. What he unleashed would terrify the empire forever. The sun over Jamaica in the mid-18th century was merciless. Its golden rays bathed the island in brilliance, but for the enslaved Africans, that brilliance was a daily curse. Every morning, as dawn broke, the fields of sugarcane shimmered in the light, endless rows of green stalks that promised wealth to Britain, yet misery to those forced to harvest them. The sweat of thousands of enslaved men and women watered those fields, but their labor never bought them freedom. Among these countless enslaved people was a man named Tacky. His story was not ordinary. He was not born into chains. Oral tradition whispers that he had once been a chief in the Akan lands of West Africa, likely among the Fante people. In his homeland, he had commanded warriors, presided over councils, and been seen as a man of authority, wisdom, and courage. But the ships of Europe prowled Africa's shores. Wars between tribes, fueled by the slave trade, left many captured. Tacky himself, perhaps betrayed by rivals or defeated in war, was taken prisoner. Shackled, marched to the coast, and thrust into the suffocating darkness of a slave ship, he crossed the Atlantic in the Middle Passage, that watery graveyard where disease, despair, and death stalked every deck. Thousands perished on that crossing. But Tacky survived. When he arrived in Jamaica, his titles, his authority, his freedom were stripped away. He was sold like cattle and placed on the frontier plantation in St. Mary Parish, one of the most fertile regions on the island. Here, the cane grew tall, the mills turned endlessly, and the crack of the overseer's whip echoed across the valleys. Life on the plantation was built on cruelty. The enslaved men awoke before the first light, summoned by horns or harsh voices. They worked in gangs, cutting cane with machetes until their backs ached and their hands blistered. Overseers patrolled constantly, quick to lash anyone who faltered. The work was relentless: planting, weeding, cutting, and hauling. The mills ground the cane into juice, boiled it into syrup, and refined it into sugar, the white gold that enriched Britain. Women carried heavy loads, tended to children, and often endured the abuse of masters. Children themselves were not spared. As soon as they could walk, they fetched water, gathered wood, and worked small tasks until they were strong enough for the fields. The food was meager. Slaves were given salted fish, yams, or scraps unfit for their masters. Malnutrition was rampant, and diseases spread swiftly in the hot, damp climate. Many died young. But perhaps the greatest cruelty was not hunger or labor, it was the destruction of spirit. Families were torn apart. A child might be sold to another plantation miles away. A mother might see her infant taken from her arms. Husbands and wives were split by the whims of owners. The system thrived on division, on breaking bonds, so that unity seemed impossible. Yet in the hidden hours of night, when overseers slept, the enslaved whispered of Africa. They gathered in huts or forest clearings, speaking in their native tongues. They remembered the gods of their ancestors, invoked spirits, and beat drums that carried the rhythm of freedom. Tacky, with his commanding presence, naturally rose among them. He spoke not as a broken slave, but as a leader who still remembered his days of authority. He reminded them of Africa, of the dignity they once had, of the courage they still carried in their hearts. On the plantation, Tacky became known for his intelligence and calm strength. He worked with the machete not only as a tool of labor, but as a weapon he knew could one day strike for freedom. Others listened to him, trusted him, and began to believe in something long thought impossible: rebellion. The timing mattered. The enslaved knew the rhythms of their masters. They observed when the whites grew careless. Easter was one such time. While the slaves toiled, the masters and mistresses prepared for church feasts, celebrating the resurrection of Christ. The irony was bitter. The same men and women who spoke of mercy and salvation by day delivered lashes and chains by night. But beneath that hypocrisy, an opportunity glimmered. During holidays, the masters feasted, drank, and let their guard down. They trusted their overseers to keep order, but even those overseers relaxed in moments of revelry. The slaves, meanwhile, endured the scraps of celebration, masking their true intentions beneath quiet obedience. Tacky began to weave a network. He traveled between plantations under the guise of errands and gatherings, but his real purpose was recruitment. He whispered to men and women in cane fields, in kitchens, in mills. He spoke of freedom, of striking back, of reclaiming dignity with machetes and fire. One by one, they joined him, not only on the frontier plantation, but also on others in St. Mary Parish. He won their loyalty not through promises of riches, but through the fire of revenge and the hope of escape. There were dangers. Informants existed. Some slaves, fearful of punishment, might betray the plan. If discovered, Tacky and his followers would face the most brutal of executions, burning, hanging, or being buried alive. The whites were merciless toward rebellion. Yet still, the movement grew. The machetes they used in the fields became their secret weapons. Sharpened in hidden places, oiled and prepared, these blades, designed for cutting cane, would soon cut through flesh and bone. In whispers and chants, the enslaved began to prepare themselves. They looked to their gods, to obeah men who blessed the rebellion with charms and rituals, assuring the fighters that bullets would not harm them. Whether superstition or faith, it strengthened their resolve. By the time Easter approached in 1760, hundreds of enslaved Africans were ready. They waited for the signal, for the moment when night would give way to dawn, when chains would be replaced by steel, when silence would break into screams. At the heart of it all stood Tacky, once a chief, now a slave, but soon to be remembered as a rebel who dared to rise against empire. The cane fields of Jamaica looked peaceful from a distance, green stalks swaying in the warm breeze, white clouds drifting lazily across a bright Caribbean sky. But within those fields echoed the cries of suffering. The crack of a whip was louder than birdsong. The groans of exhausted slaves drowned the rustle of leaves. Every overseer carried a whip, a pistol, or sometimes both. These men, often poor whites who had found no fortune in Europe, became the watchdogs of the plantation. They had no wealth of their own, but they wielded power over the enslaved with merciless pride. The overseer's word was law in the fields. One man, remembered only through fragments of colonial accounts, was notorious for his cruelty. He delighted in punishment, flogging men until their skin split open, lashing women until blood ran down their backs. Pregnant women were not spared. He would tie them face down in a hole dug into the earth, so that their unborn children were not crushed while their mothers were whipped. Such ingenuity of cruelty was designed not only to punish, but to terrify. Masters themselves were often absent from the fields, living in great houses with wide verandas overlooking the hills. They dined on roasted pork, rich stews, and imported wines, while the slaves survived on salted fish and meager yams. During Christmas or Easter, they celebrated with lavish feasts, filling their houses with music and laughter, pretending to be benevolent by tossing scraps of meat or rum to the enslaved. But the slaves knew the truth. Those scraps were not kindness, they were reminders of chains. The church, too, became an instrument of control. Ministers preached obedience, quoting scripture to tell the enslaved that God demanded they serve their masters faithfully. They spoke of heaven as a reward for patience, even as men and women were beaten outside the very doors of the church. On Sundays, while whites prayed in pews, Slaves knelt outside in the dust, forced to listen to sermons about humility while their bodies bore scars of oppression. Tacky listened. He observed. He carried every lash, every insult, like coals stoking a fire inside his chest. For years he endured silently, knowing that survival required patience. But he was no ordinary man. He had once been a chief. He remembered commanding warriors, holding ceremonies, making decisions for his people. That memory did not fade, it sharpened his anger. He saw how overseers strutted with arrogance. He saw the drunkenness of masters during holidays, the carelessness of guards when rum clouded their eyes. He noticed when guns were left in storerooms, when doors were left unlocked. Every weakness became a seed in his mind. The brutality of slavery created not submission but rage. When a fellow slave collapsed in the field from exhaustion, the overseer whipped him until his body no longer moved. His corpse was left among the cane until the day's labor ended. Tacky helped carry the body away, his face unreadable, but in his heart another vow was written. When a young woman screamed in the night, dragged into the great house by a master who claimed her as his property, the slaves heard but could not intervene. The next morning, she returned broken, silent, her eyes empty. Tacky saw this too, and his anger grew. The masters thought their system unbreakable. They believed fear would silence rebellion. They made examples of anyone who dared resist. Slaves caught plotting were tortured publicly, hanged from trees, their bodies burned to ash, or sometimes buried alive with only their heads exposed to insects and sun. Such horrors were meant to kill not only the body, but the spirit of all who watched. Yet, instead of extinguishing hope, these punishments carved fury into the hearts of the living. In the huts at night, whispers spread. Men sharpened machetes after finishing their day's labor, pretending to prepare for tomorrow's cane, but secretly dreaming of striking flesh. Women gathered herbs, not only for healing but for obeah rituals, protective charms and potions believed to shield rebels from bullets. Children listened with wide eyes as elders spoke of Africa, of warriors who resisted conquest, of spirits who guided the brave. It was in these secret gatherings that Tacky's leadership became undeniable. He spoke softly, but every word carried power. He reminded them that they were not animals, not broken things, but human beings with dignity. He told them of Africa's kings, of freedom that was once theirs, of revenge that was within reach. He promised them that Easter would not be a day of chains, but a day of reckoning. Still, there was fear. Rebellion meant risk. If discovered, every man, woman, and child involved would face slow death. Some doubted, some trembled, some whispered that escape into the mountains might be safer. But Tacky was relentless. He assured them that victory was possible, that unity would give them strength greater than any whip, any musket. And slowly, fear gave way to fury. On the plantations of St. Mary, the enslaved prepared in secret. At night, machetes were sharpened until they gleamed in the firelight. Obeah men performed rituals, sacrificing animals, smearing blood, chanting prayers. They tied charms around rebels' arms, promising that bullets would turn aside, that steel would cut true. Faith, fear, and fury blended into one. Meanwhile, the masters drank, feasted, and prayed in their churches, blind to the storm gathering beneath their feet. Easter approached, and with it came their false sense of security. But the enslaved knew. They counted the days. They waited for the night when torches would be lit, when chains would become weapons, when silence would erupt into vengeance. Tacky stood at the center of it all. His mind was steady, his resolve unshaken. He was no longer just a slave. He was becoming what he once had been, a leader, a warrior, a chief. And as the final night before Easter passed, he knew there was no turning back. The cane fields that had tasted sweat for so long were about to drink blood. The night before Easter, 1760, hung heavy over the plantations of St. Mary. A thick silence cloaked the hills, broken only by the distant chorus of crickets and the sighing of wind through cane. In the slave huts, men and women lay awake, hearts pounding like war drums. They had been waiting for this moment for weeks, perhaps for years. The time of whispering was over. The time of vengeance had come. Tacky moved silently among them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes glinting in the faint light of the moon. His very presence seemed to calm the tremors of fear that ran through his people. He did not speak loudly. He did not need to a quiet nod, a steady gaze, and every man knew. The hour had arrived. The plan had been woven with patience. On Easter morning, when masters and overseers would be caught in sleep or in drunken carelessness, the rebellion would ignite. But first came the gathering. In a clearing hidden by trees, away from the ears of overseers, fires flickered low. Shadows danced on faces drawn tight with determination. Machetes gleamed, their edges sharpened to razors. Powder and shot, stolen from storerooms, were passed hand to hand. Yet the true weapons were not just steel or gunpowder. It was belief. The Obeah man stepped forward. His body was painted with ash, his eyes wide with trance. In his hands, he carried charms woven from herbs, bones, and cloth. He chanted in a tongue older than the island itself, calling upon spirits of Africa, upon ancestors long dead but never forgotten. The rebels watched, transfixed. He told them that the charms would protect them from musket fire, that bullets would turn aside, that their enemies would fall before them like grass before the machete. Whether this was truth or hope did not matter. It gave them courage. It gave them fire. A goat was sacrificed, its blood smeared across blades, across brows. The rebels roared, a low, thunderous sound that seemed to rise from the very earth. The night air grew thick with smoke and the scent of blood, with fear and faith bound together. Tacky raised his machete high. "This land has drunk our sweat," he said. His voice, deep and steady, carried across the clearing. "Tonight, it will drink their blood." The crowd trembled, not with fear, but with anticipation. Men gripped their blades tighter. Women, too, stood among them, carrying weapons, ready to strike. Children old enough to walk looked on with wide eyes, knowing history was unfolding before them. The plan was simple, brutal, and precise. At dawn, they would strike first at the frontier plantation, where Tacky himself labored. Masters, mistresses, and overseers would be slaughtered before they could raise alarm. Guns and powder would be seized. From there, they would spread across St. Mary Parish, plantation by plantation, freeing slaves, cutting down whites, and swelling their numbers with each hour. For one night, silence held. The rebels returned to their huts, lying restless on straw mats, staring at the roofs, listening to their own breathing. Some whispered prayers to African gods. Others thought of loved ones long lost, of children sold away, of friends buried beneath the cane. Each carried memories that sharpened their resolve. The night stretched endlessly. Time seemed frozen, each heartbeat a drumbeat of fate. And then, at last, the first hint of dawn crept over the horizon. The sky turned from black to gray, and roosters began to crow. Tacky rose. He gripped his machete, its blade cold and gleaming in the early light. Around him, men and women gathered, eyes burning with the same fire. They no longer looked like slaves. They looked like warriors. The silence broke. At the signal, a cry that shattered the morning stillness, torches were lit. Flames licked the air, casting long shadows. The rebels surged forward, feet pounding the earth, machetes raised. The great house loomed ahead, its whitewashed walls a symbol of domination. Windows glowed faintly with candlelight where masters still dreamed in careless security. The slaves stormed the doors. With a crash, they burst inside. The first overseer barely had time to rise from his bed. A blade flashed. Blood sprayed the walls. Another tried to reach for his pistol, but before he could load powder, a machete cleaved his chest. Screams echoed through the house as men and women fell, one after another, cut down without mercy. There was no hesitation, no pause. Every strike was fueled by years of rage, every blow a repayment for lashes, for chains, for stolen lives. Outside, the flames spread. The cane fields hissed as fire touched them, smoke rising into the dawn. Other slaves, emboldened, joined in, their numbers swelling with each heartbeat. By the time the sun had fully risen, the first stage of the plan was complete. Masters and overseers lay dead, their bodies strewn across beds, floors, and verandas. Blood pooled in the dirt, staining the earth that had long been watered by sweat and tears. The rebels seized the gunpowder, muskets, and ammunition. They armed themselves not only with machetes, but with firearms, though few knew how to use them with precision. It did not matter. Their greatest weapon was fury. And so the rebellion spread. Plantation by plantation, the storm rolled forward. Slaves who had despaired the night before now saw hope in the fire and blood. They threw down their hoes, picked up machetes, and joined Tacky's ranks. The cry of rebellion carried through the hills. Freedom! For the whites, panic struck like lightning. Messengers on horseback fled to warn nearby estates. Rumors spread of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of slaves marching with machetes and muskets, cutting down every white in their path. In the towns, church bells tolled in alarm. But in the fields, in the huts, in the very places where chains had been strongest, the chains were shattering. What began as a whisper was now a roar. Tacky had turned the impossible into reality. For the first time, slaves on the plantations of Jamaica were not just dreaming of freedom, they were taking it with fire and steel. And yet, as the rebellion spread, so too did the shadow of retaliation. The British Empire, vast and merciless, would not stand idle. Soldiers would march, militias would gather, and blood would flow on both sides. But in that dawn, none of that mattered. The enslaved had risen. The masters had fallen, and the island trembled beneath the weight of history. The dawn of Easter, 1760, rose not with hymns of church bells, but with the screams of men dying in their own beds. What began as a spark at frontier plantations spread like wildfire across the lush, green hills of St. Mary Parish. Smoke curled into the air. Flames licked the cane stalks, turning fields into walls of fire. The sky glowed with an angry red as if the island itself had decided to burn with rage. At the heart of it all marched Tacky. His machete, stained dark, gleamed with each swing. Around him surged hundreds of men and women, once enslaved, now transformed into an army. Their bare feet slapped the earth, their chants rolled like thunder. They moved with a rhythm older than the plantations, older than slavery itself. It was the rhythm of warriors. The whites had never seen such fury. Masters stumbled out of their houses, eyes wide with disbelief. To them, the enslaved were supposed to be submissive, broken, too fearful to fight. But on that Easter dawn, fear no longer existed. Rage had taken its place. The overseers who rushed forward with whips in hand found their weapons useless. A whip could not stop a man whose arms swung with the weight of centuries. One overseer lifted his pistol, fired into the crowd, and watched the ball strike down one rebel. But before he could reload, before he could even breathe, a machete tore across his chest. He fell into the dirt, his blood soaking the soil he once commanded others to till. The great houses, symbols of luxury and domination, became slaughterhouses. Rebels stormed through doors and windows, dragging masters from their beds, striking them down in the same rooms where orders for lashings and sales had once been spoken. Women who had long endured abuse at the hands of white masters now watched as their tormentors begged for mercy. But mercy had no place on this morning. Screams echoed through halls, mixed with the crash of furniture and the crack of breaking glass. Machetes hacked not just at flesh but at portraits, curtains, and the fine wood of tables imported from Europe. The very symbols of wealth were cut down as easily as the men who owned them. Blood ran across marble floors, dripped down staircases, seeped into rugs. Outside, the rebellion grew louder. Torches were hurled into barns and cane stores. Flames roared upward, black smoke blotting out the sun. Livestock scattered, bleeding in terror. Dogs barked, then yelped as machetes silenced them. The cry spread from plantation to plantation. Freedom! Freedom! At one estate, a mistress tried to flee, clutching her children. Rebels surrounded her. Some hesitated, for even in their fury, the sight of children stirred something human. But others shouted that no drop of white blood must remain. Tacky raised his hand, steadying them. His voice carried over the chaos. Children did not build these chains. Let them live. But their fathers will pay. The rebels obeyed. The mistress fled with her children, spared but shaken, carrying with her the tale of vengeance. She would tell it later with horror, but in that moment, she bore witness to the fire that no chain could hold. By mid-morning, the rebels had seized weapons and gunpowder from the frontier plantation and nearby estates. Muskets were loaded clumsily, smoke filling the air with each shot. Few were skilled, but even an untrained hand with a musket was deadlier than none. Armed now with both machetes and guns, the rebels surged with renewed confidence. Tacky's army swelled to hundreds, perhaps close to 1,000. Slaves from neighboring estates abandoned their labor, picking up hoes, knives, and sticks to join the march. The hills of St. Mary trembled under their numbers. Everywhere they passed, whites fell. Some were cut down in fields. Others tried to hide in sugar mills, only to be dragged out and slaughtered. The rebels struck without hesitation. For too long, mercy had been denied them. Now, they denied it in return. The brutality was deliberate. For every lash endured, a cut was delivered. For every family torn apart, a house was burned. For every body hanged as a warning, overseers were hanged from their own gallows, their lifeless forms swaying in the smoke-filled air. One overseer was captured trying to escape on horseback. Rebels dragged him down, tied him to a post, and forced him to endure the lash, not with whips, but with machetes slicing shallow cuts, piece by piece. His screams carried through the hills, echoing the cries of slaves he once tortured. When he finally fell silent, his body was thrown into the flames. The rebellion was not only vengeance, it was symbolic. Every act carried meaning. Cane fields, once watered by slave sweat, were burned. The great houses, monuments to white dominance, were reduced to ash. The island itself was being remade in fire and blood. And yet, amid the chaos, there was order. Tacky commanded not as a mad butcher, but as a leader. He directed his men to seize weapons first, to grow their strength. He ordered scouts to keep watch for approaching militias. He kept his people focused, their fury sharpened into strategy. For hours, victory was theirs. By Easter noon, the news had spread far beyond St. Mary. In towns and ports, whites trembled. The thought of hundreds of armed slaves sweeping across the island sent waves of panic. Church bells tolled, summoning militias. Drums beat in rebel camps, summoning courage. The confrontation was inevitable. In the distance, the sound of muskets cracked, militias moving in. The British Empire, vast and ruthless, would not allow one parish to spark a fire that could consume the whole island. Soldiers, planters, and maroon fighters, enslaved people who had once escaped and now lived free under treaties with the British, all prepared to march against Tacky. But in those hours, before the clash, the island belonged to the enslaved. The earth shook with their footsteps. The sky darkened with their smoke. And in every scream of a dying overseer, in every flame consuming a plantation, the enslaved found something they had been denied for centuries: power. At the heart of it all stood Tacky, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of battle, his machete dripping, his eyes burning with the fire of a man who had once been a chief and was now, once again, a leader of warriors. He knew the British would come. He knew the retaliation would be merciless. But in that moment, standing among the ashes of plantations and the cries of his people, he also knew something else. He had proven that slaves could rise, that chains could be broken, that fear could be turned into fury, and that knowledge alone terrified the empire more than any blade. The smoke of rebellion still clung to the hills of St. Mary when the British struck back. What had begun in fire and machetes soon turned into a hunt, relentless and merciless. News of the uprising had spread across the island by Easter afternoon. White planters fled to fortified towns, carrying wives and children. Militia units, armed with muskets and bayonets, marched into the hills. But the most feared weapon of all was not the militia, it was the Maroons. These were Africans too, once enslaved, but now bound to the British by treaty. For their freedom, they agreed to crush slave rebellions. To the rebels, the arrival of Maroon trackers was like facing their own kin turned against them. The Maroons knew the land, the caves, the trails through the forests. They could find any hiding slave, no matter how deep they burrowed into the island's green heart. For days, St. Mary became a battlefield. Muskets cracked through the trees. Drums of the rebels pounded in reply. Torches lit the night, signaling gatherings. The rebels fought bravely, striking from behind trees, ambushing patrols, cutting down isolated soldiers. But against trained militias, mounted cavalry, and Maroon hunters, their numbers began to thin. Tacky himself remained at the center. He refused to hide, refused to surrender. His presence kept the rebellion alive. Men and women looked to him as they once had the chiefs back in Africa. But leadership painted a target on his back. The British understood that killing Tacky meant killing the rebellion. By the end of the week, blood soaked not just the cane fields, but the forests. Many rebels were captured. Those who surrendered were chained, marched back to plantations, and tortured for information. Some were hanged on the very estates they had set aflame, their bodies left dangling as warnings. Others were burned alive before gathered crowds. Women were whipped publicly. Children were sold off, scattered to different masters, so that no family remained intact. The rebellion that had begun in unity now fractured under punishment. But still, small groups of rebels refused to yield. They fought on in the hills, ambushing soldiers, vanishing like smoke. Tacky himself did not fall in open battle. Instead, his end came through betrayal. A Maroon marksman, tracking him through the forest, ambushed him. With a single musket ball, the leader who had set Jamaica aflame collapsed. His body was dragged back, his head severed and placed on a pike outside Spanish Town. For days, passers-by looked upon it. Some whites jeered, mocking the dead king. Others, even among the planters, looked with unease. For though his body was gone, his rebellion had left behind a scar. Among the enslaved, his death became a whispered story. Mothers told children of Tacky who rose against chains. Men sang songs in the fields, disguised as work chants, carrying his memory forward. Even in death, he lived. The British crushed the uprising with overwhelming force. Records claim hundreds were killed. Others were sold to harsher colonies, where their rebellion would not spread. In the official accounts, the rebellion was stamped out, order restored, plantations rebuilt. The empire pretended that Easter of 1760 was just another failed revolt. But it was not forgotten. In the quiet nights, when chains clinked and torches burned low, slaves remembered. They remembered the sight of overseers begging. They remembered the smell of cane fields on fire. They remembered the sound of freedom, however brief, echoing through the hills. And that memory was dangerous. For every slave who bent his back to the whip, there now lingered the knowledge that men and women once rose, once struck back, once made the island tremble. Tacky's rebellion had not freed Jamaica, but it had carved a wound in the empire's illusion of control. Years later, other uprisings would follow. Other slaves would whisper his name. And in 1834, when emancipation finally came, it carried the blood and fire of those who rose before. Among them, none stood taller than Tacky. His story did not end on that pike. His story lived in the haunted gazes of overseers who remembered the screams of Easter night. It lived in the fear that never left planters, who slept with pistols beside their beds, dreaming of machetes at their throats. It lived in the courage of future rebels who knew that chains could break, that masters could fall. And so, the hills of Jamaica still whisper his name. Tacky, the chief who would not bow. The slave who became a warrior. The man who turned Easter into a day of fire. Even now, his shadow lingers in the cane fields. For though the rebellion ended in blood, its spirit never died. And perhaps that is the true terror of Easter 1760. Not the flames, not the slaughter, not even the empire's revenge, but the unyielding truth that once, for a brief and terrible moment, the enslaved were free.